But talks were still being had about the idea of a supersonic transport, or SST for short. In a rather small amount of time, commercial aviation made the jump from propeller aircraft to jets, and it was believed that supersonic was the next leap for aviation. With airlines and the public expressing interest, it really was politics that got the ball rolling. Word quickly spread that the United Kingdom, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States were all working on their own versions of the SST. And it greatly mattered not only from a market standpoint on who would get it done first, but it now became about which country could be seen as the most technologically advanced, a sort of vanity race to show who was the most capable. So with those motivators well in effect, these nations got busy with this monumental engineering feat. In America, a competition was underway between the major aircraft manufacturers, primarily with Boeing, who were developing the 2707. They came out ahead, winning the government contract over other companies like Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas, who really weren't as serious as Boeing. France and the UK were also developing their own independently, but ultimately decided to unite on a joint venture to develop the SST and share the costs. It was announced in 1962 when the two countries signed their treaty, and it was quite a political move which really made a lot of sense, with two economically strong nations teaming up to share the costs, giving this project the highest likelihood of success. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union were also well into development, but theirs was what you'd call pretty awful. For them, it was more about getting it done first and giving the world the impression that their SST was superior. In reality, though, their supersonic aircraft, which was called the Tu-144, had many design aspects from the French and British projects pretty much stolen. This allowed the Soviets to fast-track their design and have it approved by government officials in a matter of days. The Soviet Union ultimately did get their way, though, as the Tu-144 took to the skies, making its first test flight in December of 1968. Just 3 months later, France and Britain was also ready to show off what they had created. They called it Concorde, and it was nothing less than an engineering masterpiece. Concorde was fitted with 4 highly powerful and unique Rolls-Royce Olympus engines, with a combined 152,000 pounds of thrust. With its unique ogival delta wing design, the narrow-body jet was designed to reach a cruising altitude of an astonishing 60,000 feet and cruise at Mach 2.2, which would later be decreased to just Mach 2.0 to save fuel. That's still a mind-blowing 1,350 miles per hour or 2,180 kilometers per hour, which is indeed faster than a speeding bullet. The flight deck featured a pretty intense-looking, all-analog design and was the first commercial aircraft to feature a fly-by-wire control system, which is essentially an electronic version of the original manual control system of inputs. Among other innovations with the electronic systems, the aircraft also featured a droop nose, often referred to as the droop snoot, a section of fuselage that could be lowered for better takeoff and landing visibility. This would all be controlled by a crew of 3 people, a captain, a first officer, and an engineer. Behind the flight deck was all the luxuries you could ask for of the time. Due to the small airframe design of Concorde, along with a bunch of weight savings, the cabin was set up in a 2-2 configuration with a maximum capacity of around 120 passengers. Truthfully, the cabin was pretty basic, but it was no doubt premium and came with a lot of quirks. Other than the fact that you were flying at twice the speed of sound, it was a small area with windows equally as tiny. In fact, they were around the size of a modern-day passport, by far the smallest in the industry. But to make up for it, you'd be receiving the very best service, and the flight experience was more like a cocktail party with free-flowing champagne and caviar. But this of course was all about speed and the ability to bring that to the public. Concorde was now ready to enter service after 13 years of development and 6 years after it took its first flight. By this point though, the landscape of air travel was already shifting, just not in the way everyone had thought. Boeing had decided to cancel their SST in 1971, despite over 100 orders being placed by numerous airlines like United, TWA, and Pan Am. Development costs ballooned out of control, and with government support drying up and a bleak market projection, the company had just killed the project. The Soviets were in a similar position. It turns out when you try and fast-track a passenger aircraft that has never been done before, it has some issues. The Tu-144 was riddled with problems, and even broke up in midair during the 1973 Paris Air Show. Tack on another 2 crashes, a horrible flight experience, and only one route option, and you have a plane that nobody wants to fly on. The aircraft entered passenger service in November 1977 and was quickly withdrawn less than a year later. Tickets were dirt cheap, and it must have cost millions to operate. But for the Soviets, it was really more of a propaganda piece, if anything. It continued with freight service until it was grounded altogether in 1983. Fortunately though, Concorde came through and entered service with Air France and British Airways in 1976. But it too wasn't without financial problems. With several public showings and great enthusiasm through the early 60s, the Concorde received numerous orders from basically all the large airlines of the time. Pan Am had ordered 6 of them and showcased it alongside the cancelled Boeing 2707. TWA was another customer who got as far as to make a mock-up of the Concorde with the TWA livery in 1967. These were in the company of other airlines like United, American Airlines, Air Canada, Qantas, and many more. There was also a good deal of interest in a Concorde Type B, which would have had additional fuel tanks for a longer range. Initially, it was projected that the market could be interested in up to 350 jets by 1980, and these first few orders were rather promising. But sales soon started to dry up once some hard-hitting realities dawned on the Concorde program, mainly in the form of where the aircraft would even be able to fly. The US conducted tests in the mid-1960s to gauge what effects sonic booms would have over a populated area. Sonic booms are of course the after effect of an aircraft going supersonic, and the result of that test was a lot of annoyances and even property damage. Concorde was a noisy plane, and its sonic boom would likely disturb everyone below its path. So SSTs were then banned from flying over the United States, destroying any plans for possible routes from, say, New York to Los Angeles. Therefore, the aircraft could only be flown over oceans, and because of its range limitations, it could only make non-stop flights over the Atlantic, significantly limiting what routes airlines could put it on. Mix in the 1973 oil crisis, and airlines began to bail. In fact, the majority of airlines had canceled their orders for Concorde that year. The rest would soon follow also in the early 70s, and that just left Air France and British Airways as the sole operators. Despite all of these issues though, Concorde was the new icon of the skies. It was an immensely popular aircraft and known by name around the world. Everywhere it visited, crowds would flock to see it arrive. It was a spectacle, a jet unlike any other, and one which millions aspired to travel on. It was the pride of France and Britain, and a testament to the incredible mid-century spirits and engineering achievement. It truly became one of, if not the most iconic and beloved aircraft in existence, even for many watching the skies, surpassing the Boeing 747. Of course, those two planes couldn't be any different from each other and served very different purposes. While all other airliners of the time were designed for seat capacity and ticket margins, Concorde was all about speed and luxury. It really was a step above everything else. There was business class, then first class, and then there was Concorde. As you could probably imagine, the prices fitted the prestige, with a one-way flight ranging from $6,000 to $9,000 per person. For round-trip flights, fares could easily surpass $13,000. And for many, it was worth it, with the unique experience you were in for, crossing the second largest ocean in under 3 hours. Because of the demand and low volume, those prices had to be high, often with clientele made up of business travelers and celebrities. Concorde was something of opulence now, and actually making money for the two airlines, and it continued to do so through the 80s and 90s. However, these golden years would not last forever.